Hello everyone. Today we are going to start carving the maxillary canine. Here is the wax block. As usual, we start by drawing the midlines on all the sides. Mark the four aspects: labial, mesial, palatal, distal. The crown length is 10 millimeters. The root of a canine is one of the longest in the arch. It's going to be around 17 millimeters. After we have marked the crown length and the root length, we start with the labial aspect carving. From the labial aspect, we can see that the canine has a cusp in the center with a mesial slope and a distal slope. Here is the mesial side, so we have the mesial slope and the distal slope. The mesial slope is shorter than the distal slope. The cervical width is 5.5 millimeters and the maximum mesiodistal width is 7.5 millimeters. For the ease of marking and carving, we'll mark the cervical width as 6 millimeters, that is 3 millimeters on either side. The maximum width is measured from either side contact area. The mesial contact area is at the junction of middle and incisal third. The distal contact area is in the middle of middle third. So our maximum mesiodistal width of 8 millimeters should be between these 2 points. So we mark 4 millimeters on either side. Once we have marked 4 millimeters on either side, we join these two lines, same as that of carving of an incisor. Next, we divide the labial aspect into 3 parts: the cervical, middle and the incisal third. The mesial contact area is at the junction of middle and incisal third. The distal contact area is in the middle of middle third. The cusp tip is slightly more mesially placed to the midline than the distal aspect. So when we mark a point 0.5 to 1 millimeter more mesially and join the contact area to this, automatically the mesial slope will be shorter than the distal slope. So this would be the rough outline of the canine from the labial aspect. The next step would be to cut the wax through and through. This is the smoothening of the mesial slope of the canine. We cut the distal slope next. Make sure you have a single line representing the cusp. As you can see here, there's a single line on the cusp tip. Afterwards, you cut the other aspect of the cervical portion. You can make out the rough outline from the labial aspect. The mesial contact area at the junction of middle and incisal third, the distal contact area in the middle of middle third, and there is enough convergence towards the cervix. After I have finished with the labial aspect, we turn over to mesial or the distal aspect, whichever is convenient. In this case, I am turning over to the distal aspect and drawing the midline, as the midline would have gone when you have carved the labial aspect. The canine has a very prominent labial ridge, which has a crest of curvature in the cervical third. Similarly, on the lingual aspect, there is a very prominent cingulum. The cingulum also remains in the cervical third. One prominent feature about a maxillary canine is that the cusp tip is more labially placed. So we mark the cusp tip 1 millimeter labial to the midline. We again divide the distal aspect into 3, the cervical, middle and the incisal third. At the middle of the cervical third, we mark 2 points on either side. Then we measure the cervical width at the cervix, that is 7 millimeters, so 3.5 on either side. Then the maximum width is 8 millimeters. The canine typically has the labiolingual width more than the mesiodistal width. So we mark 4 millimeters on either side at the cervical third, because the crest of contour is maximum at the cervical third. Once we do this, using these 2 marked points, we draw curves on the cervical third. When we draw a line joining the cusp tip and the curve what we have drawn, similarly lingual aspect, we join the curve to the midline. This gap of 1 millimeter what we have given labially ensures that the cusp tip remains labially. Following this, along the marked lines, we cut the wax in a straight line. Now this is the labial surface. Make sure that you remain 1 millimeter labial. Then at the cervical third, you remove a small piece of triangular piece of wax. Now when we look at it, you can see there is a sharp bend at the cervical third. Do the same with the lingual aspect. Only in the lingual aspect you have to remove wax till the midline. You can see that the wax is coming down towards the midline. Remove a little more. You can see that there is a flat surface on the top. Let this 1 millimeter width be there so that you can adjust the position of the cusp later on. Same as the labial aspect, remove a small triangular piece of wax at the cervix. This will give the cervical constriction. This will be the finished outline. We have to check the dimensions of the labiolingual width at the cervix and at the maximum. Here, more on either side. Has to be 8, just around 1. So you start reducing the wax equally from labial and lingual side. Once you have reduced the dimensions to the correct size, the next step would be to make a concavity on the lingual side. Now, this being the palatal or the lingual side, we know that the cingulum remains in the cervical third. So, your first step would be to divide the lingual surface into 3. You have the cervical, middle and the incisal third. Starting from the junction of middle and cervical third, you deepen this line and remove a layer of wax towards the cusp tip. When we do that, automatically there will be a seat that is produced on the lingual side. You can see there is a seat developing here. Now you can appreciate there is a proper seat that has developed, and you can see the cusp tip is becoming sharper. Once we do this, we turn over to the incisal aspect. From the incisal aspect, the lingual portion, the mesiodistal width of the lingual line angles is much shorter than the mesiodistal width of the labial line angles. This is called as the lingual taper or the lingual convergence. To carve the lingual convergence, we extend the midline onto the cingulum. Mark 2 points, a millimeter on either side. Then starting from these two till the midpoint of the mesial and the distal cusp ridges. You can see that the cusp ridges are very broad. These are representative of the contact areas on the mesial and the distal side. So on the midpoints, you draw 2 points here. Join the line towards this 1 millimeter distance what you have carved. Once you do this, looking from the incisal aspect, you remove wax so that there is a slope developed on the lingual aspect. So this will give you the lingual convergence or lingual taper. From this aspect, you can appreciate that the labiolingual width of the tooth is wider than the mesiodistal width of the tooth, and you can appreciate the lingual convergence that has developed in this aspect. Now we have seen the tooth from the labial aspect. We can appreciate the mesial slope is shorter, distal slope is longer, mesial contact area is at the junction of middle and incisal third, distal contact area is in the middle of middle third. When we look at it from the distal aspect, the labial crest of curvature is in the cervical third. You can see a prominent cingulum here. The cusp tip is more labially placed, and you can appreciate the lingual convergence from the incisal aspect. The mesiodistal width of these lingual line angles is shorter than the labial line angles mesiodistal width. Another important feature about a maxillary canine is that the distal aspect, in this case on the left hand side, the distal aspect appears to be stretched towards that of the premolar. That is mainly because there is a concavity present distal to the labial ridge. The labial ridge runs from the cervical line till the cusp tip. It's a prominence because of the prominent central lobe of the labial aspect. Mesial to the labial ridge, the mesiolabial line angle is rounded, whereas distally it is more concave. First we smoothen the mesiolabial line angle to make it more rounded. On the distal aspect, we will incorporate the concavity of this curved portion of the carver by passing the carver distal to the labial ridge in this manner. Now you can appreciate that automatically there is a small concavity developed on the distal aspect. Round off the distal and the mesial contact areas. Make sure you do not reduce it, otherwise your mesiodistal width will reduce. When we look at it from the incisal aspect, you can see a very prominent labial ridge. After this, we will be checking the dimensions again, correcting the dimensions. The reason why we correct the dimensions at this stage is, when we start to carve the lingual fossa, you are going to carve the marginal ridges. If the dimension is less, the marginal ridges cannot be carved. If it is more, if you carve the marginal ridges and then correct the dimensions, you are going to reduce the marginal ridge in that portion. So we will first check the dimensions. 8 millimeters and 7 millimeters. It is a millimeter long, wider than in the mesial distal aspect. So I will be reducing it. Reduce it equally from the mesial and the distal aspect. Labiolingually it should be 8, it's around 9 millimeters. You redo all the steps so that the dimension reduces by a millimeter. Now we have reduced the dimensions. Round off the crest of curvature labially and lingually. Correct the lingual convergence again and round off the cingulum from the incisal aspect. Clear of all the wax debris. You can appreciate that the distal aspect appears to be more stretched because of the concavity that we have provided here in this aspect, and the mesial surface is more convex. You can appreciate the labial ridge from the labial aspect. The dimensions have been corrected. You can see the cusp tip, which is more labially placed, the cingulum, the contact areas again, the lingual convergence, and the more stretched appearance towards the distal side. The next step would be to carve the lingual fossa. Unlike these incisors, the lingual surface of a canine has a lingual ridge which divides the lingual fossa into two. You have a distal lingual fossa and the mesial lingual fossa. As the distal slope is larger, the distal fossa also becomes little larger than the mesial fossa. So step 1, we draw two triangles on either side. Once you draw these two triangles, you can appreciate this is the marginal ridge, this is the cusp ridge, the mesial side, on the distal cusp ridge and the distal marginal ridge. Use the other end of the carver and scoop out a layer of wax in this triangle. Extend the fossa slightly on top of the cingulum. Now you can appreciate prominent lingual ridge, mesial fossa and the distal fossa. Clear out all the wax debris. You can even appreciate the prominent lingual fossa from the incisal aspect, which is definitely the case as the cusp tip is more labially placed and we can see more of the lingual surface, and the prominent lingual convergence accentuates the lingual fossa towards the singular. Following the completion of the crown, the root would be slender and pointed towards the apex. So from the labial aspect, draw two lines, the width of which will be the cervical width from both labial and distal aspect. We cut the wax uniformly on either side. Be careful, as the root is long, it may break down. Once you do this, carefully remove the wax from the root surface, looking at the incisal aspect so that no portion of the root is visible from the incisal aspect. Be careful not to extend the root length. When we cut the wax, looking at the incisal aspect, the lingual convergence which was given to the crown automatically gets incorporated onto the root. It's like a cylinder around the crown. Remove the excess so that the width, the labiolingual dimension, is same as that of the crown. The canine root is tapered with the maximum width at the cervix, and then it tapers down to the apex. Canine is unique in the way that it can both have the tilting of the apical third of the root either mesially or distally, but in majority of the cases it is towards the distal aspect. So to give a curve on the distal side, we remove a small piece of wax at the apical portion from the mesial aspect, and then give a concavity just underneath using the concave portion of your carver. So automatically you can appreciate that the root appears to be tilted distally at the apical third. We then taper the root at the apex. From the lingual as well as the labial aspect. You can see that the tapering at the apex. Now smoothen the surface. The next step would be to draw the cervical line. The cervical line is uniformly convex, with the convexity towards the apex of the root from the labial and the lingual aspect. The mesial and the distal aspect shows a convexity towards the cusp tip. The mesial aspect being 2.5 millimeters and the distal aspect being 1.5 millimeter. So we start marking from all the aspects. Labially, the cervical line is from 10 millimeters, which is the crown length. Distally, 8.5 millimeters, as it is 1.5 millimeters short. Mesially, 7.5. Lingually again at 10. Once we do this, we draw a uniform semicircular line, extend the line onto the distal and the mesial aspect. The distal one being a little shallower than the mesial aspect. Once you have preliminarily drawn the cervical line from all the aspects, we remove a layer of wax from the cervical line towards the root in this fashion. Do this from all the aspects. Once you have done that, redraw the cervical line. Since the canine has a very long root compared to all the other teeth, the anchorage would be less as it is a single rooted teeth. To improve the anchorage, there are developmental depressions on the mesial as well as the distal aspects of the root. The distal one being little more deeper and more pronounced. So we draw a uniform developmental depression on the whole surface of the root. We remove a layer of wax on mesial and distal aspect. Equally initially. Later on, we remove a layer of wax extra from the distal aspect, which will make the distal concavity or depression more pronounced. We smoothen the outlines of the developmental depression. And then we polish the tooth surface. Once we polish it, you can appreciate the irregularities on all the surfaces very clearly. Now this would be a guide for you to remove the wax wherever required. You can appreciate the uniform depression here. Same way on the distal aspect, which is more deeper. Remove all the debris of wax on all the surfaces. Remove the debris from the cervical line. Once we do this, polish the surface again. Polish it again. Make all the surfaces uniform and shining. You can appreciate the root apex being tilted more distally from this aspect. Make sure you don't make the cervical line as a notch. It should just be demarcating the crown and the root portion. Now this is the finished tooth. You can appreciate the crown and the root being tilted and evenly tapered. You can appreciate the cervical line, which is uniformly convex towards the apex. The mesial contact area is at the junction of middle and incisal third. The cusp tip is in line with the root from the labial aspect. It appears to be stretched a little from this aspect towards the distal. And when we look at the incisal aspect, you can appreciate the concavity which is there on the distal aspect. And the cusp tip is more labially placed, which is more pronounced from the mesial or the distal aspect. And here the mesial side, you can see the developmental depression on the root, which is less prominent than that of the distal aspect. The crest of contour on labial and the lingual aspect remains in the cervical third. It is uniformly convex with a prominent labial ridge, which is again appreciated from the incisal aspect. The variation in the lingual side is a prominent lingual ridge in the center. Dividing the lingual fossa into two, you have the distal and the mesial one, the distal being a little larger than the mesial with a prominent cingulum which is on the cervical portion. This finishes with the carving. Happy carving!